At the end of the 18th century, something strange began happening at Versailles. Not people disappearing, not theft. Gold was vanishing, slowly, as if someone was licking it off the palace doors. Servants found the court alchemist at night, kneeling in dark corridors, fingers raw to the bone, mouth moving as if chewing, even when there was nothing left to eat. He ate the gilding from doors, frames, and altars, convinced that gold remembered the sun and could teach the body not to die. When they finally found him dead, his stomach was eaten through, hollowed as if by acid. But his teeth gleamed perfectly, coated in a thin, metallic sheen. And the strangest part? Versailles never quite recovered. Because the gold was not gone entirely. Some of it still lingers in the dust. And those who walk the halls today sometimes taste metal on their tongues and feel an urge, an ancient, impossible desire, to eat more. They first noticed it on the doors. Not the ceremonial gates flung open for foreign envoys, but the narrow service passages where mourning began in silence and candle smoke sank low, staining the air with wax and soot. The gold there looked wrong. Not scratched or peeled, but fatigued, as if it had been breathed on for too long by something warm and patient. When fingers brushed the surface, a fine metallic dust clung to the skin, faintly greasy, carrying a heat that did not belong to cold metal, as though the palace itself had begun to perspire. Versailles was never truly asleep. Even before dawn, the corridors murmured with distant steps, the sigh of settling stone, the soft rustle of silk abandoned on chairs. Smells layered thickly in the air, polish, damp wool, perfume gone sour by morning, and beneath it all the faint animal odor of too many bodies living too close to power. It was in this half-light, when servants moved without being seen, that the change became undeniable. Gilded edges dulled within days instead of decades. Decorative seams lost their sharp brilliance and grew pale, almost anemic, as if something had been slowly drawn out of them. At first, blame settled where it always did, on humidity, careless cleaning, the age of the palace. But the pattern spread. Hinges, frames, ornamental flourishes near the floor where hands might linger too long. The gold was vanishing not in flakes, but in absence, leaving behind smooth, worn scars that caught the light in an unsettling way. Touching these places produced a strange sensation, a warmth that lingered on the fingertips, accompanied by a bitter taste at the back of the throat, as if the body recognized something it was not meant to. Versailles in those years felt like a body holding its breath. The court still glittered, but the shine was frantic, overstated, layered thickly to hide the rot beneath. Laughter came too loudly, feasts ran too long, and the walls absorbed everything. They always had. Secrets sweated into tapestries, ambitions seeped into stone, and now something else seemed to be feeding quietly in the dark. Rats gnawed beneath the floors. Men whispered of shortages beyond the gates. The palace responded by consuming itself. By the time the servants began washing their hands twice, scrubbing away the metallic residue that refused to leave the creases of their skin, the sense of unease had already settled deep. Doors felt warmer at night. Gilded surfaces seemed almost soft under pressure, yielding just enough to make the stomach tighten. The gold no longer reflected candlelight cleanly. It absorbed it, drank it in, leaving shadows thicker than they should have been. No one spoke openly about it yet. Versailles had survived stranger things, and silence was its oldest habit. But the palace remembered every touch, every absence. And somewhere within its endless corridors, something had begun to eat. Versailles in the final years of the 18th century was a body rotting beneath perfume, its decay disguised by ritual and repetition. Silk softened the sound of coughing fits in antechambers, thick drapes absorbed whispered panic, and wax seals pressed into letters served less to protect truth than to suffocate it. Marble floors gleamed above a different reality, where rats gnawed at crumbs of empire and damp crept patiently into foundations never meant to feel cold. The palace breathed in cycles of excess and denial, inhaling praise, exhaling waste, every corridor heavy with the knowledge that nothing living inside its walls was meant to last. The court surrounded itself with specialists in delay. Astrologers charted skies thick with omens and selectively ignored the stars that spelled collapse. Physicians bled patients already pale from hunger of the soul, prescribing powders and tonics that smelled of sulfur and rot. Priests murmured absolution so frequently that sin lost its meaning. And among them moved the quieter men, those paid not to heal or to predict, but to promise eternity itself in forms that could be swallowed, rubbed into skin, or whispered into the ear at night. The court alchemist was one of these men, though he rarely called himself such. Titles were dangerous when expectations grew sharp. He preferred to remain a presence rather than a name, drifting between chambers like a draft that carried the faint scent of copper and incense. He was thin as a blade, shoulders narrow, joints pronounced beneath layers of dark fabric chosen less for fashion than for concealment. His fingers were long and stained, always bearing a faint discoloration that no soap could lift, as if he had dipped them too often into substances that remembered his touch. His lips were the most unsettling feature. They carried a dull yellow stain, uneven and persistent, visible even beneath powder and wine. Servants noticed it first, because servants noticed everything. The stain never faded entirely, no matter how often he washed or how carefully he applied balm, scented with myrrh. It clung to him like a confession the body refused to keep silent. When he spoke, his mouth smelled faintly metallic, and those who stood too close felt an involuntary tightening in the stomach, a reflexive response to something the body recognized as wrong. He had arrived years earlier, quietly, recommended by a chain of names no one could fully trace. He brought letters heavy with wax and heavier with implication, promises written in dense script about preservation, transmutation, resistance to decay. The court had been eager then, still pretending collapse was a rumor rather than a certainty. He was given a room near the older wings, close to storage corridors and forgotten chapels, places where curiosity rarely lingered and sounds carried poorly. Within those walls, he worked patiently. Glass vessels lined his tables, clouded by residue that caught candlelight in dull rainbows. Powders lay wrapped in parchment, labeled in codes only he understood. He burned metals until they screamed softly, melted alloys that gave off fumes sharp enough to sting the eyes, and kept meticulous notes written in a hand so tight it seemed to resist movement. The air in his chambers was always warm, even in winter, heavy with the scent of heated ore, resin, and something faintly sweet that lingered on the tongue long after one left. He was not alone in his beliefs, but he was alone in his discipline. He believed that decay was not a natural law but a failure of containment, that the body, like any vessel, could be reinforced if one understood its weaknesses. Flesh failed because it forgot what it had once touched. He believed memory could be restored through consumption, that materials forged under immense pressure and heat retained lessons the body could learn, if introduced slowly, deliberately, without fear. Gold obsessed him not for its beauty but for its refusal. It did not rust. It did not tarnish willingly. It endured fire, burial, time itself, emerging unchanged except where violence had been applied. He believed gold remembered the sun, that its permanence was not passive but active, a quiet resistance to entropy. To him, it was not decoration but instruction, a substance that could teach the body how to remain. At first, his experiments were modest. Dust scraped from coins dissolved into wine. Thin leaf, shaved from damaged ornamentation, mixed into bread. He monitored himself obsessively, recording sensations with clinical precision. Heat behind the eyes, a tightening in the jaw, a faint vibration beneath the sternum. Pain followed, as he expected it would, but pain was not failure. Pain was information. As months passed, his presence changed. He grew more withdrawn, more focused, his movements economical, almost reverent. He avoided mirrors, not out of vanity but concentration, as if looking too long at his own reflection risked distraction. Servants noticed that his waist smelled wrong, sharp and metallic, lingering in corridors long after it should have dissipated. They noticed that animals avoided his door, rats scurrying away as if sensing something hostile to flesh. The palace, meanwhile, continued its performance. Balls glittered, music echoed, Laughter bounced off ceilings painted with scenes of mythic permanence, gods frozen in youth and triumph. Yet beneath the sound, attention crept like mold. Food arrived later. Faces grew sharper. Anger simmered just beyond the gates, carried on rumors and distant shouts that echoed faintly through stone at night. The alchemist listened to these sounds with interest rather than fear. Collapse, to him, was confirmation. Empires decayed because they were composed of perishable materials. Stone cracked. Wood rotted. Flesh failed. He believed himself to be working toward a different architecture, one that could survive the fall intact. By the time servants began to whisper about the gold fading in the lower corridors, his conviction had hardened into hunger. What had begun as study became ritual. Consumption was no longer measured in grains, but in deliberate acts carried out in silence, often at night, often in places where history clung thickly to surfaces. He chose his sources carefully, favoring older gilding, metal that had absorbed centuries of touch, breath, and intention. He believed age strengthened it, enriched it with memory. Versailles did not resist him. It rarely resisted anything done quietly and with purpose. It absorbed his footsteps, his breath, his work, just as it absorbed the secrets of kings and the prayers of the desperate. And as he moved through its veins, thin and determined, the palace began to lose something it had long taken for granted, a brilliance not merely decorative, but symbolic of permanence itself. The body beneath the perfume was being eaten from within, and the palace, like the man, did not yet understand that endurance and destruction can look identical in their earliest stages. Servants began finding him in places where no one lingered long, spaces designed to be passed through rather than inhabited. Narrow passages behind altars, storage corridors where the air smelled of damp linen and extinguished candles. Small doors set low into paneling, their hinges worn smooth by centuries of unnoticed hands. He was always kneeling when they saw him, spine bent at an angle that suggested devotion or strain, fingers pressed to gilded seams as if testing for warmth. His nails were blackened, split at the edges, the skin around them raw and inflamed, and his mouth moved constantly, working with slow, deliberate motions that looked disturbingly like prayer. At first, they assumed madness. Versailles produced madness the way cellars produced mold, quietly and without spectacle. But this was different. He did not mutter or sway. He did not weep or laugh. His movements were precise, almost reverent. When discovered, he never startled. He simply withdrew his hands, wiped his fingers carefully on a cloth already stiff with residue, and rose without haste, leaving behind a section of molding dulled to a pale, exhausted sheen. The gold began to vanish in earnest then. Not in the dramatic stripping that would come later, but in increments so small they defied immediate notice. A hinge less bright than its twin. A decorative line along a doorframe thinning, losing its edge. Flakes disappeared grain by grain, shaved with tools so fine they left no obvious scars, or simply loosened by repeated contact, absorbed into skin, breath, saliva. The palace shed its brilliance the way a body sheds heat, slowly, invisibly, until the loss became impossible to deny. He consumed it methodically. Sometimes the flakes were mixed into wine, sinking slowly to the bottom of the glass before being swallowed along with sediment and bitterness. Sometimes they were pressed into bread, kneaded until the dough glittered faintly, then baked until the metal dulled, softened, and cracked. Often, there was no disguise at all. Gold placed directly on the tongue, where it dissolved into heat and pain, sending a sharp sensation down the throat and into the stomach like a warning ignored. Each act left its mark. His stomach burned constantly, a low, gnawing heat that never cooled. His sweat grew sharp, metallic, carrying the scent of heated coin and blood. Sheets in his chamber stiffened where his body lay, residue crystallizing in pale stains that caught the light like frost. His breath left a taste in the air that lingered too long, making servants cough and avert their faces when cleaning near him. And still, he persisted. He believed gold remembered the sun. Not metaphorically, not poetically, but physically, structurally. He believed it carried within it the memory of heat so intense it altered matter itself, Pressure so absolute it erased weakness. To consume gold was, in his mind, to invite that memory into the body, to teach flesh what it had forgotten. Pain was not a deterrent but a sign that instruction was taking place, that the body was being forced to adapt. As weeks passed, his appearance began to change in ways that unsettled even those accustomed to decay. His teeth grew unnaturally bright, not white but reflective, catching candlelight at sharp angles. His gums receded, exposing more of that gleam, and his lips cracked despite constant balm, the yellow stain deepening, spreading unevenly as if something beneath the skin were surfacing. His weight dropped rapidly, flesh tightening over bone, giving him a drawn, elongated look that made his eyes seem too large for his face. The palace responded subtly, as it always did. Doors he favored grew warmer to the touch. Gilded surfaces near the floor developed a faint softness, yielding just slightly under pressure before returning to shape. Servants complained of a bitter taste in their mouths after working near certain corridors, of hands that smelled metallic no matter how often they washed them. Animals avoided those areas entirely, rats altering their paths, horses snorting and refusing to pass certain thresholds. Rumors began to spread, whispered between tasks, carried in looks rather than words. Some spoke of a curse, others of alchemy gone wrong. A few, quieter still, wondered if he was succeeding. There were moments when his movements seemed steadier, his posture less frail, as if the pain that racked him also sustained him. His skin, though taut, did not bruise easily. Small cuts healed quickly, leaving pale scars that shimmered faintly before fading. He took this as confirmation. His hunger intensified. What had once been experimentation hardened into routine, then obsession. He began to favor older sections of the palace, areas untouched by recent renovation, where the gold had absorbed generations of touch, sweat, reverence, and neglect. He believed age enriched it, that the accumulated presence of history made it more potent, more instructive. Each flake consumed was, to him, a lesson learned, a step closer to a body that would not yield. At night, when the palace quieted into its uneasy half-sleep, he moved through corridors with deliberate care, tools hidden beneath his coat, breath controlled, senses sharpened. He scraped, collected, consumed. His hands shook not from fear but anticipation, the body already responding to the promise of heat and endurance. Pain followed each act, radiating outward from his gut, crawling up his spine, settling behind his eyes in a steady pressure that never fully released. Still, he did not stop. The palace continued to dull. What had once gleamed now absorbed light, reflecting it poorly, as if tired of being admired. Visitors remarked on the change without understanding it, attributing it to age, to poor maintenance, to the mood of the times. No one yet suspected a single man, thin and silent, kneeling in the dark, teaching his body to eat what empires used to pretend would last forever. And beneath the gold, beneath the ritual and conviction, his stomach slowly destroyed itself, walls eroding under substances never meant for flesh. He recorded every sensation, every shift, convinced that collapse was merely transformation misunderstood. Versailles watched, patient and indifferent, as one of its quietest inhabitants consumed its skin in the belief that permanence could be swallowed, grain by grain, until decay itself forgot how to begin. As the palace emptied and whispers of revolution crept closer, his hunger sharpened into something urgent and exacting. Versailles began to hollow out, not all at once but in stages, like a body losing blood faster than it could replace it. Courtiers departed under pretexts that fooled no one. Chambers once thick with laughter stood silent, their air stale, their floors cold. Servants were dismissed in careful waves, their footsteps echoing longer than they should have as they left, carrying rumors with them like infection. The palace did not protest. It had always known how to shed excess. In the spaces left behind, the absence was louder than any crowd. Sound traveled too far. Candlelight lingered too long on surfaces that no longer reflected it properly. Gilding vanished at an accelerating pace. Mirrors lost their frames entirely, left as naked sheets of glass that reflected faces too clearly, without the softening border of gold. Painted cherubs stared down from ceilings stripped of their halos, their expressions suddenly accusatory in the harsh light. Decorative seams along walls became pale scars, lines where brilliance had once masked the joints between stones. No one bothered to repair the damage. The illusion of permanence had fractured, and with it the will to maintain appearances. Versailles had begun to look like what it was, an enormous structure designed to defy time, now failing quietly under its own weight. Outside its gates, the world shifted, voices rising in volume and confidence, while inside, one man worked faster, driven by the sense that opportunity was narrowing. His body reflected that urgency. The changes that had begun subtly now advanced without restraint. His teeth shone unnaturally bright, catching even weak light with a sharp gleam that made others avert their eyes. The gums around them receded steadily, inflamed and tender, exposing more enamel than should have been visible, as if his mouth were being stripped down to something harder and more enduring beneath. His breath grew heavy with the smell of iron and rot, a dense exhalation that clung to the air and marked his passage through rooms long after he had gone. His skin stretched tight over bone, losing its elasticity, pulling sharply at joints and cheekbones until his face looked sculpted rather than grown. Veins stood out beneath the surface, dark and insistent, as though something inside him were expanding, demanding space the flesh could no longer provide. He felt constant pressure beneath his ribs, a sensation not entirely painful, but profoundly wrong, like a vessel being overfilled. Eating ordinary food became difficult. His body rejected it, responding with nausea, cramping, an instinctive refusal that left him weak and trembling. Gold, however, still went down. It burned, it cut, it scraped, but it stayed. He welcomed the sensation, convinced it meant integration rather than rejection. Each swallow brought heat that radiated outward, settling deep in his core, a furnace that drowned out hunger, fear, even fatigue. Sleep became rare and shallow. When he did rest, his dreams were crowded with images of light compressed into matter, of surfaces that could not be broken, of bodies that did not yield. He moved through the palace with increasing boldness. There were fewer eyes now, fewer questions. Entire wings stood abandoned, their doors unlocked, their contents exposed to dust and silence. He harvested freely. Gold leaf peeled from walls in long, satisfying strips. Ornamental flourishes crumbled under his tools, reduced to flakes that glittered briefly before disappearing into cloth or mouth. The palace no longer resisted. It felt resigned, as if it understood that being consumed was simply another phase of its existence. Servants who remained avoided him openly now. They crossed themselves when passing his door. They spoke of heat radiating from the floors near his chambers, of metal fixtures that burned to the touch without flame. Some claimed to hear scraping at night, not the sound of tools, but something closer to chewing, slow and methodical, echoing faintly through empty corridors. No one confronted him. Authority itself felt fragile, a thin shell over chaos. Outside, the city churned. Inside, he accelerated. His notebooks filled faster than he could organize them, pages dense with observations, sketches of anatomical cross-sections annotated with symbols rather than words. He noted changes with satisfaction. Cuts sealed rapidly, leaving little trace. Bruises faded almost as soon as they formed. His pulse felt slower, heavier, as if each beat carried more weight. He convinced himself that the pain in his abdomen was temporary, the cost of transformation rather than its failure. But the signs grew harder to ignore. His hands trembled violently when not occupied. His urine darkened, thick with sediment that glittered faintly before settling. His stool carried an unnatural sheen, catching light in a way that made him hesitate before recording it as progress. The smell that followed him intensified, a mixture of heated metal and decay that no amount of incense could mask. The palace seemed to react in kind. Floors near his favored routes warped subtly, boards lifting and settling with temperature changes that did not match the weather. Metal fixtures grew dull and pitted, as if proximity alone drained them. Even stones seemed affected, developing hairline cracks along gilded seams. pale lines that mirrored the scars left behind where gold had been removed. Versailles was shedding its skin, and beneath it lay something brittle. He interpreted everything as confirmation. Collapse outside meant time was short. Transformation inside meant success was close. He pushed himself harder, consuming more, ignoring the way his vision blurred at the edges, the way his heart occasionally stuttered in his chest. He believed he was building something that could not be taken from him, something immune to mobs and fire and time itself. By the time the palace stood nearly hollow, echoing with absence and distant unrest, he had become a figure both feared and pitied by those few who remained. His silhouette, gaunt and rigid, moved through stripped halls like a relic in motion, carrying the last remnants of Versailles' stolen brilliance inside a body that could no longer contain it. The palace and the man mirrored one another now, both reduced, both altered, both convinced that what was being lost was merely excess, and that what remained would endure. They found him collapsed behind a chapel door during a gray morning when bells rang without conviction, their sound thin and mechanical, stripped of faith by repetition. The air was cold and smelled of damp stone and extinguished incense, a scent that clung to the throat and refused to clear. Light crept in through high windows without warmth, settling across the floor in pale strips that revealed dust and neglect rather than sanctity. He lay partly obscured by the door itself, as if he had tried to retreat into the narrow space between hinge and wall and failed at the final moment. His body was rigid, twisted inward in a posture that suggested both defense and surrender. One arm was drawn tight against his chest, fingers curled, as if still gripping something invisible. The other stretched outward along the stone, nails dark and split, the skin around them cracked and inflamed. His mouth was frozen half open, lips pulled back from gleaming teeth in an expression that unsettled even those accustomed to death. It was not agony alone, nor peace, but a strange convergence of triumph and horror, as if he had reached the edge of understanding and recoiled only after stepping too far. The smell around him was unmistakable, iron and rot, sharp and heavy, layered over the stale sweetness of old incense. It clung to his clothing and skin, saturating the narrow space behind the door until breathing felt intrusive. Those who approached instinctively slowed, as though entering a contaminated area where haste might provoke something unseen. The stone beneath him was warm to the touch, an unsettling contrast to the cold air, and faint discolorations marked where his body had lain, as if heat and residue had seeped into the floor itself. They moved him carefully, though no one spoke of respect. The stiffness of his limbs made the task awkward, joints resisting movement with unnatural firmness. As he was turned, his coat fell open, revealing a torso stretched taut, skin drawn thin over sharp angles. Veins traced dark paths beneath the surface, branching and intersecting like stress fractures in glass. There were no obvious wounds, no blood spilled in the dramatic fashion expected of sudden death. Instead, there was the impression of collapse from within, of systems failing silently until the structure could no longer hold. When examined, the truth emerged with quiet brutality. His stomach was ruined, its lining eaten through as if by acid, walls thinned and perforated beyond recognition. The damage was extensive, far exceeding what any poison or illness could reasonably explain. It was as though he had poured something fundamentally incompatible with flesh into himself again and again, ignoring every warning until the body simply dissolved around it. The surrounding organs showed signs of strain and inflammation, but it was the stomach that bore the full cost of his conviction. And yet, amid that devastation, there was an incongruity that unsettled even the most hardened observers. His teeth gleamed flawlessly. Not merely clean, but radiant, each one coated in a thin, uniform film that caught candlelight and reflected it sharply. The effect was uncanny, reminiscent of coins placed over a corpse's eyes, a gesture meant to prepare the dead for passage. The film resisted scraping, resisted solvents, clung to enamel with an intimacy that suggested permanence. In that moment, it seemed the only part of him that had truly endured. Word spread quickly through what remained of the palace. Those few servants still present gathered in clusters, whispering with the urgency of people who sensed that meaning lingered just beyond comprehension. Some crossed themselves repeatedly. Others stared too long, drawn by the unnatural brightness of his teeth, by the idea that something of value had survived where flesh had failed. No one suggested mourning. He had been a quiet figure, tolerated rather than loved, and his death felt less like loss than punctuation. The chapel itself seemed altered by his presence. The door behind which he had fallen bore fresh scuff marks, pale streaks where gold leaf had once decorated its edges, now reduced to scars. The air remained warm long after his body was removed, and candles placed nearby burned unevenly, flames bending toward the space he had occupied as if drawn by residual heat. The stone floor beneath him retained its warmth through the morning, refusing to cool despite drafts that stirred dust and chilled the bones. His chambers were searched with caution rather than curiosity. What they found confirmed what many had suspected but few had dared articulate. Tools worn smooth by use, cloths stiff with metallic residue, notebooks filled with dense, obsessive writing, diagrams layered over one another until meaning dissolved into repetition. There were stains that glittered faintly under light, embedded into wood and fabric alike, resisting removal as stubbornly as his dental coating. Everything smelled of heated metal and old blood, a scent that lingered in the nostrils long after one left the room. Outside the chapel, bells continued to ring, marking hours that felt increasingly irrelevant. The palace no longer pretended to function as it once had. Corridors echoed with absence. Windows stood unshuttered, letting in a light that revealed every flaw, every place where brilliance had been stripped away. His death did not feel like an end so much as a confirmation, proof that the pursuit of permanence within a decaying structure was always destined to turn inward, consuming its host first. As the day wore on, attention shifted outward. There were more pressing concerns beyond the gates, louder voices demanding recognition. His body was prepared for burial without ceremony, wrapped and removed with efficiency that bordered on relief. Yet the image of his face lingered, that frozen expression suspended between victory and terror, the gleam of his teeth etched into memory. Some would later claim that in death he proved his theory, that a part of him had indeed resisted decay. Others dismissed it as coincidence, chemistry mistaken for transcendence. But those who had seen him lying behind the chapel door understood something more disturbing. He had not failed entirely. He had simply misjudged what could endure. Flesh had surrendered, as it always does, but the gold had remained, silent and brilliant, marking the boundary between belief and consequence with unforgiving clarity. The palace absorbed the event as it absorbed all things, without judgment and without pause. Another body removed. Another secret settled into stone, and somewhere within its stripped halls, light continued to catch on surfaces that no longer shone as they once had, reflecting a truth too stark to ignore. Versailles survived him only briefly. The palace did not collapse in a single moment of fire or blood, but unraveled, thread by thread, as the world beyond its gates finally breached the illusion of permanence. What one man had taken in secret, thousands would soon take openly. Gold was no longer something to be preserved or hidden behind etiquette. It became proof, evidence of excess made tangible and therefore punishable. Hands that had once polished it now tore it free. Fingers bled. Tools broke. Laughter echoed where whispers had lived. Hunger and righteousness worked together with terrifying efficiency. The stripping was methodical at first, then frenzied. Walls were scored down to stone. Ceilings were scarred, their wounds visible from below like exposed bone. Decorative seams that had once guided the eye gently through space were reduced to jagged lines, their purpose erased. Gold leaf fell in clouds, catching light briefly before being crushed underfoot, ground into dust that clung to skin and clothing and hair. Versailles inhaled and exhaled that dust, filling its lungs with the remnants of its former self. What had taken the alchemist years to consume was undone in days. He had worked carefully, reverently, believing each fragment carried memory and heat and promise. The crowds believed only in immediacy. Gold was currency now, not transformation. It was melted, traded, hidden, lost. It passed through countless hands, each touch stripping it further of meaning, until it became simply metal again, dull and obedient. And yet not all of it left. Fragments remained. They lodged themselves deep within the palace, worked into cracks and pores too small for fingers or tools. Dust settled beneath floorboards, inside walls, in the weave of tapestries too damaged to salvage. It mixed with ash and plaster and the residue of countless lives that had passed through those halls. Time compressed it further, pressing it into stone and wood alike, until it became inseparable from the structure itself. The alchemist's bones were buried without marker, placed into the earth with efficiency and indifference. No record preserved his name. No ledger noted his experiments. He was absorbed into the anonymous mass of the dead, indistinguishable from those whose labor and hunger had built the palace he consumed. His notebooks vanished, scattered or destroyed, their pages too strange to preserve, too unsettling to study. Only his work endured, not as theory or proof, but as contamination. Years passed. Regimes changed. Versailles became something else, then something else again. Restoration replaced revolution, preservation replaced destruction, and caretakers returned with different intentions and cleaner hands. They patched scars where they could, filled gaps with imitation, painted over absence, and called it continuity. Visitors arrived in steady streams, their footsteps softened by carpets, their voices lowered by the weight of history. They admired what remained and imagined what had been lost, unaware of how close the two still were. The gold dust lingered. It rose when floors were swept, when walls were repaired, when sunlight heated stone just enough to loosen what had settled. It entered lungs unnoticed, settled on tongues, mixed with saliva and breath. Generations inhaled it, swallowed it unknowingly, carrying traces of Versailles within their bodies for hours, days, years. No one grew immortal. No one transformed visibly. But some sensations defied easy explanation. Caretakers spoke of an occasional metallic taste at the back of the throat that no illness could account for. Visitors reported sudden warmth in empty corridors, a pressure behind the ribs that faded once they stepped outside. Restoration workers sometimes paused mid-task, struck by an inexplicable reluctance to discard what little gold remained, even when instructed to do so. The feeling passed quickly, leaving embarrassment in its wake, but it returned often enough to be noted and dismissed repeatedly. The palace itself seemed to remember. Certain rooms retained heat longer than others. Certain doors resisted replacement, their frames subtly warped, their surfaces faintly warm beneath fresh paint. In some corridors, light behaved strangely, lingering on edges where gilding had once been thickest, tracing shapes that no longer existed. The building held these remnants without comment, without intention, simply because it had no mechanism for forgetting. Those who walked the halls even now sometimes felt it. A tightening in the chest. A sudden awareness of the body as something temporary and insufficient. An urge that did not feel personal, ancient and bright, surfacing without invitation. It whispered not in words but in sensation, a suggestion rather than a command. Endure. Remain. Take in what lasts. The feeling dissipated quickly, swallowed by reason and habit, but it left a faint aftertaste, metallic and unsettling. Immortality, it seemed, had not vanished. It had simply been dispersed, diluted across centuries and bodies and stone. No single vessel could contain it. The alchemist had been wrong in his certainty, but not entirely mistaken in his instinct. Gold did remember something, not the sun, but consumption itself. It remembered being taken, being coveted, being swallowed by structures and people alike. It remembered survival through division. Versailles stood on, restored and curated, its wounds documented and framed as lessons. The narrative spoke of excess punished, of history corrected by time. But beneath the polished surfaces and controlled lighting, traces remained, work too deep to remove. The palace had been eaten once in secret, then devoured openly, and now continued to feed quietly, grain by grain, on those who passed through it. Nothing dramatic followed. No bodies gleamed. No stomachs burned away in revelation. What persisted was subtler and perhaps more enduring. A shared impulse, a recurring hunger, the idea that permanence could be consumed, if only in fragments, if only over time. Versailles did not grant immortality. It taught something else instead, something far less comforting, that the desire to outlast decay does not die with those who pursue it. It settles into places. It waits, and it continues to whisper, patiently, to anyone close enough to taste the metal in the air.